newly established Union of South Africa became an empire during the First World War, as its defence force overran neighbouring German Southwest Africa in 1915. The highly mobile operations and rapid conquest differed markedly with the trench warfare that prevailed elsewhere in the Great War. Yet fighting under the British Empire's banner also proved highly controversial and ruptured Afrikanerdom, triggering a great rebellion in 1914 that interrupted the deployment to Namibia. How the Southwest was won by South Africa is the subject of today's podcast.
Antonio Garcia, our guest today, is a former combat engineer in the South African National Defence Force, who has served in missions in the Sudan, the DRC, and within South Africa and on its borders. Tony has published widely on military history and strategy, including, most recently, a book, Botha, Smuts, and the First World War. So there's nobody better placed to discuss our subject today, which is the German conquest of South Africa in 1914 to 15 during the Great War.
Yeah, I'd like to kick off with the question. Welcome, Tony. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be with you both today, and I look forward to this discussion. Yeah, that was quite an introduction. I'm feeling a little bit embarrassed, but lovely to be with you both.
Firstly, to start off with, can you tell us how Southwest Africa came to be German?
Sure. So in the late 1800s, we have to take this time for what it was, the scramble of Africa, or the scramble for Africa. Germany had some ambitions to be a colonial power. They weren't, as, if I can put in inverted commas, successful as perhaps Britain or France. And they managed to establish a small foothold in a number of places. One of them is modern-day Namibia, and by then called German Southwest Africa, or at least to us. And they had a very complicated relationship with many of the African nations, the Wambo, the Rero, and the Nama. And I think something that's come out quite recently was the reparations and some of the discussion around the Nama and the Rero genocides, 1904, 1908. And that's brought it back into the public eye and into the mainstream media a bit more. And this ongoing discussion about how terrible that was, of course, and what can be done to give something back to the people of Namibia.
So tell me, you said, Germany came into the scramble for Africa a bit late, and, they got, they didn't get the juiciest bits of Africa, actually. So what was the value of the colony to them, apart from, status? Why would Britain and South Africa have wanted it during this time?
So I think a part of that is tied up with geostrategic questions. The Cape of Good Hope and Cape Town, where I'm from, has always been important. So if we think back a few hundred years before the Napoleonic Wars, the Dutch take it over for trade reasons and for going to the East, Dutch East India Company stuff. And then the British take it over because they want to secure this geostrategic trade route. And even in modern times, it's still important and we've seen it recently when the Suez Canal was closed and with the fighting in Yemen, that all the shipping had to be diverted through the Cape of Good Hope. So the same back then, it was still the same geography, still the same geostrategy. And what Germany wanted was to have some sort of naval bases, and then also they allowed them to have some sort of projection in that part of the world. And then later on, it was very convenient, the right word, let's go with it, convenient that they found some mineral resources to be exploited in that area. But yeah, juicy, it certainly wasn't the juiciest, but because if you just land there, they have the Namib Desert. So it makes for, and a beautiful place, by the way. I think our family lived there from like in the 80s, Walvis Bay, and I've sort of vague memories of this kind of striking sea and dunes and whatever, but that's just an aside of it. But that's more or less how it all came to be. And then of course the tensions came in as South Africa's history evolved and became more close to the British Empire, etc. And then, but I don't want you to jump the gun on that one.
What I want to do is break up the following sense, because South Africa is a part of the British Empire, and I want to discuss, first of all, before we discuss the British imperial war strategy, the debate within South Africa about entering the war, and then we'll discuss how it fell within the British overall strategy.
I think it's still a divisive topic in South Africa, especially in certain communities, and not to labor the point, but if you think about 1914, we go back 12 years to the end of the Anglo-Boer War, the Second War, however you want to call it, or the South African War, and there we had a bitter fight, a terrible fight, and you had kind of lots of the history being rewritten, but you had brothers fighting brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, they're all fighting each other. And you have lots of people, the hands uppers, and the people crossing over and fighting for the British. And this was, I should have maybe given some context there first. That's where Britain tries to take over the Transvaal, and we have a full war with the Free State and the Transvaal fighting the British Empire, and doing a very good job. But eventually, of course, the might of the British Empire, logistics, etc., wins the day, and slowly they grind them down. And it's really a terrible war because concentration camps are used, women and children of all races are put in there. The fields are burnt, and they slowly grind down. So it's really a terrible conflict. And this is just for the background to it. After the war, Louis Botha becomes one of the leading figures, him and Jan Smuts, and they develop quite a strong relationship, or had one, with the British Empire. And I'm going to fast forward a little bit. They get self-governance for the Transvaal, then the Free State, and then they form a union, which really was 4 different parts, because you had 2 colonies historically, Natal and the Cape, and then 2 independent republics, the Free State and the Transvaal, and they just merged this, an experiment. So everyone has different interests, etc. And then here comes, but this is the way to get ahead, at least in Botha's mind, and Smuts and their followers with the South African Party, broad church, bring everyone together. It's great. But of course, if it was myself and my brother was killed 12 years before my kid, there's no ways in hell I'm fighting for you. And this, you can imagine, was the heart of the divide in it. And the motivations becomes difficult. But as you mentioned, Thula, this becomes the debate in Parliament. And they say, well, we have to join the war. Botha is a general, he's sworn allegiance to the British Empire. I mean, Jan Smuts might be more British than the British at this point. So, this is where they're going. And 2 brilliant men and their followers pushing it. And on the other side, we have Barry Herzog and De Wet and all those kind of stalwarts of Boer fighters, etc. And they're saying, well, we can be neutral. And Botha said, no ways can we be neutral. We're part of the empire. He said, yeah, but okay, we can be part of the war, but we don't actively have to take a role. Now it starts getting into academic debate, because it's neither here nor there. But that's eventually the divide. And then I don't know if you want to move into that right now, but that eventually becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back, because all the, I don't want to say right, but the poor Republicans, all the people with the axe to grind, and people that also have personal political issues, right? So there's a whole layer. Like on the top, they think, oh, Botha's taken advantage, and on the bottom, you have people who are really poor, and they don't see some of the the so-called benefits of aligning with the British. People in the Free State are maybe more agricultural, and people in the Transvaal had more farms, etc. A bit more better farms than the mining industries and all that comes with the mining industries. So obviously, I'm going over really broad strokes over here. People will write to you later on that, picking me up, but fair enough.
I'd like to, I think let's try and layer it in the following way. It's the Union Defence Force, which is going to be deployed into German Southwest Africa. What is that? When is it established? And is this its first baptism? And then I'd like to speak, because my understanding is that there's the idea that they're ready to go to German Southwest Africa, but then the rebellion occurs. So I'd like to just speak about the Union Defence Force, its background, its trajectory, and then speak about why German Southwest Africa. What is the plan and what is the strategy? And then we can focus on the rebellion. I think if we just do it in those layers.
Absolutely. So the Union Defence Force was like a microcosm of what South Africa was at the time. 4 different, at that point, provinces or colonies with different traditions, military traditions. And I think Ian van der Waal, who co-authored the book with me, and of course is a friend and a professor and all that. And he says, he has a lovely quote. We quote Wyndham, and he says, the kind of Natal and the Cape defense systems is like a faint trace of the British system. I think it says it really well. So it has a lot of the elements, but in a South African style. And then, of course, we have the Free State and the Transvaal, which has the commando tradition, which is really citizen fighters. And I mean, it's a mix of amateurs and really brilliant people. And, they come out later on De Wet, Delray, Botha, and then the old timers like Bert, Lucas Meyers, etc. But they have a tradition of being quite strong and firm. And they, in typical fashion, are a bit of improvisation. And there's a line from Botha that we find when they're setting up the UDF, and he says, the skills that we had back then, horse riding, marksmanship, the stuff that you would have from living on the land, we don't have it anymore because things are urbanizing. By the 1900s, 1910, people are moving to cities, things are becoming a little bit different. So that's an interesting line that we found. And then he puts Smuts in the job, and he becomes the Minister of Defense along with Interior Mines, of course, the man's a show off. And then he puts together the Defense Act of 1912, which starts bringing this formally together. And it really is bringing these separate cultures and systems together, which then gets deployed into, as you mentioned, into German Southwest Africa. And the reason for it is very layered, of course. I mean, there's 5,000, German colonial Schutztruppe, so they can't mount a strong offense into South Africa with 5,000 soldiers. It would be impossible. So the only hope is to fight by proxy or some sort of rebellion. And there are historic links between Germany and the Boers of South Africa. So it's really a bit ironic to many that they are now fighting on the side of the British. And so at that point, this kind of marriage of British and also let me add, there were also people of color. Tremendous amounts of, and that's historic, right, from way before this Anglo-Boer War. But people as guides, as people providing the labor that's needed to build trenches. There's no ways they could have done this amazing, like the Degela Lines trenches. It's almost certain, that there were people helping doing that of all races in South Africa. And the same is the case in German Southwest Africa, where I know this, you'll come onto it later about inverted commas, air quotes, white man's war, but there was a lot of, it was a combined force. And of course, history was written in a certain way. But these two systems come together and they start to advance, and it's a catastrophe because they are, they're different interests, they are different approaches, and ultimately maybe it was too soon.
Just within the overall British imperial strategy, because now you're right, I recall it as well, the somewhat semantic academic argument as to, yes, South Africa is automatically at war, but we should have been able to determine the extent of our involvement, and of course the British troops stationed in South Africa can withdraw, and we'll take care of ourselves in the meantime. And then we have this infant, defense force that has to take this on. But within Britain's idea, their greatest strategy, and sending this kind of a force into Namibia, how does this fit in? With their war plans?
So central to their idea is to neutralize the communication systems, that the wireless transmitters that they are in German Southwest Africa or modern Namibia, and that's a big part of it. And then also to take over the naval bases, and that stops German naval projection through much of the southern Atlantic. And that's one of the key elements that the British are looking at. And of course, Britain is currently, has been historically, a sea power, right? So this is very important. Of course, military historians, we love talking about the army because for some reason we love it, and who was behind that and firing here and this and, Napoleon and Wellington and so on. But the naval element is massive. And if we think about how force and logistics is projected into the theater, the Navy is so important. So this was a little bit about the broader strategic aims in German Southwest Africa. And then on the South African side, that what you mentioned, they also had an interest in the land. I mean, the idea of a South Africa at the time was more a concept. It wasn't firm. I mean, the Orange River, fine, but the idea was a little bit more fluid than that's fixed. So there definitely was an eye on territorial aggrandizement.
What I find astonishing is the extent to which, for both Germany and for the Empire, they capture this enormous territory for the sake of a coastline. And then you have all these peoples in the interior, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I've picked up on imperial ambitions in the 19th century Cape, in which the Cape actually wanted to expand itself into German Southwest Africa. And now you have all these peoples and dynamics. So that's actually what brings us to the rebellion in German Southwest Africa, because we have the rebellion in South Africa. Again, because one can say head office did not consider the dynamics of the local office. But the same goes, I assume, for German Southwest Africa. So please tell us about this.
So, yeah, I think when the First World War starts, there's no plan for invasion, and or no formal plan. There's no staff system. And I just want to mention one point. I maybe put it a bit heavy previously, but even though the UDF is new, the soldiers, officers are hardened and they are experienced. Many of them have experience in the Anglo-Boer War, the Botha Rebellion. So many of them are very capable. But bringing them together, that's the tricky part.
Could I just step in here? When the martial law declaration comes in, because we often tend to treat the Afrikaner Rebellion and the invasion of Southwest Africa as different, there's this phrase in there which speaks to the country being invaded from Southwest Africa, and it speaks about a junction between the Afrikaner rebels. And I think there's one theater of the Afrikaner Rebellion which is based on cooperation. There's a sort of very murky situation in that desertified border where the boundaries between the two territories are rare. What was the conversation? Was there conversation? Yeah. Was there conspiracy? Was there collaboration between them? What happened?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, there was collaboration. 100%. And it was exactly what those Republican Boer leaders wanted. It's what they craved. But it was a token agreement from the Germans in Southwest Africa. We can give you almost no weapons, almost no support, but if we win the war, you guys will be ace. So this becomes tricky. But of course, geographically, they are able to operate just south of the border because the train tracks takes them all the way down, and they are able to do a bit more damage in those isolated areas. And there's a couple of battles, which we can pull out. Not that I want to go into that amount of detail, but you're absolutely right, where they do reasonably well, and there certainly is collaboration. And the irony is that the initial invasion force in 1914, one was General Lucan, and when I was at high school and I walked down the gardens, going home, and you saw the statue up, I never knew who the hell he was. I was like, it was like years later. Anyway, that's just an aside. There was no Marits next to him, just by the way, not in Cape Town at least. And one of the other people who had to invade was Mani Marits, and it's often or Marits, however you want to pronounce. And then the Afrikaner Rebellion is sometimes called the Marits Rebellion. And the irony is, you have this marriage, the British element or historical, and the Afrikaans element, one led by Marits and one led by Lucan to do the initial invasion. Of course, Marits doesn't do it. He's in collaboration from the start. So Lucan deploys up. There's some elements of amphibious assault. There's some landings happening on the coast, but this is a failure, and this failure is strongly because of the collaboration, and Maris just pulls back. At this point, the Marshal, Kemp has resigned, and and Botha and Smuts are, of course, frustrated. They know more or less that things aren't going well, but this is really something that shakes South Africa. And whereas and it's good that you put it like that, Thula, that the two are parts of the same whole, right? The entry into the war, and it becomes all the frustrations and that, whatever it is, it could be your socio-economic status, political interests, personal issues. My family was, everything comes to the boil at this point, everything, and you have this clash, and really it becomes, even though Hertzog is there in a big way, it's a clash between Botha and De La Rey. Excuse me, De La Rey, okay, he's part of it, and De Wet, I was going to say. De La Rey is, of course, a tragic figure, that he dies just before the rebellion, and people will debate and have fistfights in bars for years to come about, was he going to rebel or not? Most likely he was, right? Because at the time he was shot, he was, he was going towards Potchefstroom and blah, blah, blah. So most likely, whether he would have gone very far, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. Something might come out in the historical record with time. But that was so divisive. Botha was at pains to convince De La Rey. They were friends. Smuts served under De La Rey in the Boer War. But when all this is said and done in this open rebellion, Botha's focus is solely on South Africa. A few token things, keep things sort of, keep something on the back burner, but ongoing in German Southwest Africa. But he needs to stabilize because the wheels come off, right? It's you have people defecting. It's a full-on rebellion. And De La Rey has a hell of a name. To face him is difficult, but of course, Botha had all the levers of power at that time, and also a fine general himself. So that's really how that works. And of course, the Germans were fomenting rebellion. They were, it was we'll and Maritz takes this view to Beyers and to the others, and they all kind of rebel in a typically South African way, a little bit differently. Kemp is this dashing guy, and doing crazy tasks and or adventures, and that's his style, and he's a bit irreverent. Beyers is this tragic figure, and he ends up dying in a tragic way. You're not sure if he was going to fight or not fight, and he kind of retreats and drowns, unfortunately. And then you have De La Rey, who in some ways is brilliant and great, but we're not sure how far he was going to go. But Botha and Smuts slowly quash this, piecemeal in each theater in South Africa, so in the Free State, in the Transvaal, etc., and then gets this thing in order to relaunch the invasion in 1915.
So tell me, the rebellion itself, how did this affect the operations in German Southwest Africa?
So everything had to stop. Because they would have a stoke. I think some force remained, just over the border, and we had some deployments on the coast. But effectively, any offensive operation in German Southwest Africa stopped for a number of reasons. One, Botha and Smuts had to centralize all the resources so that you could deal with the one and the other, sort of, so not to divide your strength. And then I think also a big part of it was they weren't sure if they were coming and going at that point. This great idea, untested force. I mean, the UDF was not in a great state. The soldiers might have been tough and ready for adventure, but in terms of a well-functioning military machine, it had, it was still teething. It was going through a lot of teething challenges at that point. And so the rebellion in some ways gives the UDF, Botha, Smuts, and all the others a chance to reset and to test itself. And obviously it's a different setting because they internal operations and they can deploy really quickly, via train, and they can and then on horse afterwards in the kind of commando fashion. They with Botha leading a number of those operations, and Smuts being the he really was a one-man staff system just by himself in Pretoria with, Bourne and a few others. But, because there weren't many staff officers at the time. And I'm not saying they want any, but he would constantly check the logistics, deploy it. The intelligence picture comes in, and you can imagine him and Louis in conversation about it. Just trying to figure out how to do it. But they did it they quashed it really quickly. On your earlier point, Lindsay, you're right that they want to handle it from the start by themselves. And I wanted so that all the British forces were sent out of South Africa, and they could be deployed to France and to other theaters. And even afterwards, when the rebellion breaks out, there's a question, should we send in some forces to help you guys? And Botha was adamant, no ways, we're going to sort out our own mess. For two reasons, I'm sure many reasons, but one of them, he's capable and he's confident in that way. And secondly, when German Southwest Africa happens, he wants to have it for himself, and then they can trade, that geopolitical, elements afterwards. They want to grab that territory.
Of course. And now, they get the rebellion under control by the end of 1914, and now they can get to war properly. What happens now?
So, you're right. So, sort of 1915, there's a couple of these attempts at Uppington, including on Thula's earlier point, this kind of German-supported, offensive, but they fail dismally, and eventually they surrender, camp included. And now, effectively, 4 different forces can deploy into Southwest Africa. I can't remember. It'll be difficult for me to remember all of them, but so sort of southern and eastern from cross-border, and then you have central and the north. Deploying from Ludritz, and then from Office Base Swakopmund in the north, and from there it becomes a massive logistical operation to cross this desert and to catch a retreating force, because at this point Frank takes over. I think he was a lieutenant colonel, and von Heidelberg was the previous German commander who dies in an accident, and Frank is not really, he's really isn't a very, very average commander. Maybe brave or something like that, but very average. But Heidelberg had a bit of savvy, and he knew how to handle things a bit more. And he was in command at during the initial invasion at the Battle of Sanfontaine when the Germans won. He was in command. But now we're in a new phase. The South Africans are deploying massive forces on a number of different lines of advance, and for the Germans, it's very difficult to think where to concentrate their force, because if they go to one area, easily they'll be enveloped in another. And there's quotes from Botha, who just you just see when he writes to Smuts just how he understood the operational theatre. I mean, it's really geeky kind of how the generals thought stuff, but I found it so fun, not funny, but so entertaining when he says, if they take us and they stay in us, they'd have to be crazy to stay there, because of course, and he just goes through and methodically explains, and this is all during it. So I really enjoyed, because you see, those primary sources, you see how they thought at a certain time, and especially between him and Smuts, and eventually Smuts comes up to take command of basically the southern and eastern and central forces, or the south. They combine, form the Southern Army, and Smuts comes up to take command, and then you see some interesting exchanges between Botha when Botha writes back to Smuts and says, "Hey, I've read your invasion plan," and of course he's a diplomat. But firstly, let me welcome you and thank you so much, but your plan's wrong. So it's funny, but. And Ian and I try to discuss it in the book that it's hard, it's almost unfair that we take a private correspondence 100 and whatever years later, and then because between them there's a rapport, and he loved Smuts, and Smuts loved him, and he knew Smuts was a good general, but between them they had direct way of communicating, and Botha was probably the former commandant general, and in this case he was still the boss, but that doesn't take away from Smuts, because he was brilliant, and everyone acknowledged the victory wouldn't have happened without him. But then they consolidate the south, and Botha pushes in the north, and they hit a couple of defensive positions around Forta, which is in the, I might pronounce it properly, but in the north, on the northern advance, and it's really all just logistics. the trains that, how they're going to lay the train tracks, how they're going to advance, how we get logistics for a certain amount of time or enough resources, and you move forward in bounds each time. And Botha had the situation with hindsight. Maybe we can say that too. But even reading the commentaries at the time, he was right about a lot of it. And Smuts, and of course his staff also. It wasn't just himself, and it was this logistics, the laying of train tracks, the clearing of tracks, boreholes, the work, the drivers, the scouts, and that's where people of color really enabled this campaign. And that's why some of my peddling my own work, but some of my work on the first what I call very cheekily the first campaign victory of the Great War. The amount of crap I got for that, if I could go back in time, I would change it, because nuance is lost. But a lot of that was to say that people of color had a very important role in the war, and I'll go and complain later about how we remember this war in South Africa, with current government, and because even the predecessor of the ANC recruited for the war. And I know, this becomes an issue of myth and where we are now, but my view is we always have to acknowledge, those that did a service. And for now, you might say it's for good or bad, but we need to give not treat it with a passing neglect. But I'll be crucified for that later too.
I'd like to push back on your self-crucifixion there, for the simple reason I'd like to think about this in terms of the broader war. Okay, everybody knows the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's strategy to win. They were going to win by mobility, but they failed outside Paris. Okay, so that doesn't work. Then we get the trench warfare, brutal slog. Around the same time, we've got the British trying to find a soft belly in Gallipoli. That descends into a bloodbath. But you're describing a very different war here, where there's mobility, there's movement, there's breakthrough, and there's success, and there's a specific conquest. And correct me if I'm wrong, do the Germans lose any major colony before? It must be one of the first major territories that Germany wins. And I remember from going through the newspapers at the time that it's quite a fillip at the time. So I would actually be tempted to hold on your guns there. I think it's a small war, it's a peripheral war, but it's a tonic which for the British Imperial forces that they can actually win something rather than be stuck in this long, indecisive, all quiet on the Western Front style warfare. So what am I getting wrong in saying that you would be well entitled to hold your guns as far as this is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I was a little bit tongue in cheek, but you're right, Thula, and I never interrupt someone when they agree with me. In the same way that Napoleon says, never interrupt your enemies when they're making a mistake. So this is the positive side of it. No, I do, I do agree. It was, yeah, I think with as you mentioned, where the argument holds strong is that this wasn't a token force surrendering, and some of the earlier campaigns, that's what it was. They had a little police force, and they, someone has surrendered. This was an actual fight, and it was led by a dominion, and that's what I actually meant. That's why I said nuance is lost. So because I put it in a footnote somewhere, just to the publisher wants the bigger title, and then. But yes, it was the Dominion-led first victory, and this is the one that gave everyone a boost. And on the Western Front, people would put up little placards, and so you're right, it did bolster the war effort and morale, and it was a war of maneuver at a time when, on your earlier point, at a time when, and of course the terrain allowed it. And let's be honest, this was the ideal war for sort of historic commando forces, commando in the Boer sense, not the modern, kind of Marines and special forces, but which, there's a link, but okay. So it was perfect for them, having these vast expanses to maneuver and to do that, not a difficult jungle. And the British forces also were well suited for, I'm not saying they weren't issues, but for doing the long marches, for holding terrain. And then they also had cavalry units which worked pretty well. But it was perfect because those old, I mean, now we're sort of going into a bit of myth, but the old commando units, they had a lot of decentralized command. So they, Botha could say, look, you're going to go and get number Tony, see you later. That was it. So decentral, but it's based on trust. So you figure out yourself how you're going to do it. And that was what they were really good at with the training from the Anglo-Boer War. There was no big logistical system behind them. And that's what they did really well. And he chose his commanders really well for that. So it becomes a good case study for that kind of maneuver. And I've got some friends who are very anti this kind of military concepts like maneuver. But I did declare to them that we aren't like taking a concept as truth. We're just saying this is what happens. It will happen. Here's some facts. It might square with this theory, So that was how I tried to get out of that one.
So I will say part of my fascination in this regard, being a biographer, of course, and you've got a biographical component here. So you said earlier on, you feel bad about reading, reading the letters of 100 years ago. I live for those. I'm sorry. I live for peeking into people's private lives, like back in the past, at least. But what really has always fascinated me, and I have never felt like I could quite get a sufficient answer, is Botha and Smuts' motivations for going into the field again, especially on Botha's part, actually. Are they trying to recapture their glory days? And no other country sent its prime minister and his right-hand man to the front. In this case, you said earlier on, they said, we want to do this ourselves, which they absolutely did. But I mean, he took us quite far. Can you give us some insight into that?
I mean, he took it very far. I think, he's one of the few, and I think it comes back to that kind of commando tradition. And when I say that, I mean, this commando would not, just for our listeners, I know you guys know this, but it wouldn't only be who's the actual commander, who's the falconer, but it would also translate into a system of farming and a system of loyalties. And in this historic tradition, you would often find your commandant general or your most senior commander would later achieve a political office. That would happen with Kruger, for example, or Joubert or others. And it wasn't uncommon, and even in Botha's lifetime, to go on commando during the Zulu Wars, and then with a very dubious deal with Dinizulu Ketshwayo, his dad was Ketshwayo, get a piece of land from the Zulu kingdom because you won the fight for them. And so this was within his lifetime, right? Within Botha's lifetime, within Smuts' lifetime, and many others lived and knew this tradition, I am speculating a little bit, of course. I'm not. I can give you some of the evidence that I found, but this is, of course, just some broader context. So this was within his lifetime that they've achieved. They did those things, and they very much, I think, they kind of signed up to this agreement with the British Empire, and in typical kind of military fashion, they've just gone ahead with it. There was no stakeholder analysis. Oh, what does this person feel that? No, it was just, and since 1903 onwards, slowly but surely they built this up. And I think, in some ways, as brilliant as Smuts was and Botha was, they were careless, in many of these things. I mean, Botha lost two brothers in the war. Their own family. I mean, Botha's family eventually went to the Netherlands, but Smuts' family was in a concentration camp. So they had experience of it, but somehow they had this whole idea reconciliation was very convenient, a very convenient answer. And you find you find quotes that says, I wonder when Botha's going to practice this conciliation for his own people. And on these letters that you mentioned, Lindie, where you kind of have a nosy into people's lives. But I think that was a part of it. And he wasn't initially going to lead the invasion. He had Luke and he had others. But then I think when the wheels comes off and everything goes to hell, there's a letter he writes to Leitz, who was also a supporter of the Transvaal, that goes to the Netherlands. And he says, and you can imagine my difficulty in translating Dutch to with my matric tweede taal Afrikaans, so Google Translate had to help me a little bit too. And he says, I must go and do my duty. and that's what he says too late. So there's very much in the letter, and that's very much that kind of idea, like, right, come on. And I think a part of it is glory days, a bit of the boss over there, a bit of that. But I think it was necessity driven. I think if he could have hanged out in Pretoria, he would have done so, because the next political objective, and I'm more of their concern, was the politics. I think if you look at the letters, half of it is discussing operational matters, which is like got to get some wagons and a few of this. The rest is like, who's going to get this portfolio? Who's going to get that one? And they're thinking about the 1915 elections, and that becomes telling. And they are betting a lot on the fact that they're going to do nation building through the creation of a UDF, and do nation building through building this and then taking new territory. And then they're going to say, like the old commando leaders, well, yeah, let's take our farms up there. We're going to help if I can say it like that, from that time, the poor whites, which was an issue. Yeah, take a farm, the sharecroppers and all that. So there was a lot of things going on. And just for more context, not to bore you guys to death, but in 1913, the Land Act comes into being. And this is a response to the so-called poor white problem, people's grievances, especially poor farmers who are Afrikaans, or poor farmers. And it's against black sharecroppers. And many of them are doing really well. And, people like Semi Pixley, one of the founders of the ANC, is creating like some sort of, what's it called, like a co-op, a cooperative, and he's sort of getting into the Eastern Transvaal. And who's from the Eastern Transvaal, right? It's Botha. I don't have evidence of did they actually clash, but eventually, we're going to see that there was a little bit. But I think ultimately it was the more right-wing elements, Del Rey, Herzog, and others, even in Transvaal, that pushed it more, to get this. And the Land Act, I mean, as we know, they set out a lot of the agenda for the oppressive legislation and others that would follow throughout the 20th century. But coming, sorry, please come in. Sorry.
No, but I will say, I think you have officially now given me the first satisfactory answer to my question ever, because I think what you've actually pointed out here is, so many other layers of South Africa and statehood and modernization during this time. Because for some reason in my mind, or in one's mind, somehow we think 1910 as this incredible watershed. Suddenly South Africa becomes a modern state. Modern states leaders don't go to war themselves, without realizing that you're absolutely right. They come from that particular tradition, and that sense of responsibility. So that makes sense to me. But the other component, and I can't help but, as I listen to you, drawing the parallels to the present day, because I've often said that 1910 and 1994, just the amount of comparisons that can be made, Botha and Smuts and Conciliation, post-94 South African reconciliation, having to bring disparate forces together into a new army, first from the old commandos and the sliver of or shadow of an army from Natal and the Cape. Here you had to integrate the old South African army and MK, and the from the armed struggle. And then the other one that you just mentioned now, the idea of trying to nation build during this time. Could you speak to some of these parallels? Did you see it as well?
I mean, it excites the imagination, and I think I'm going to talk on that now. But when Thula appeared, and this is not meant to be a name drop, on our podcast, and we will of course love to publish this too, for just to promote the show, which is great and just up my alley. But when speaking to Thula, he it was interesting. Many of the questions that I had, the answers that came back, made me think, because it was about this idea of myth making and how similar things may or may not be. But actually, when you evaluate the evidence, so he just drew on certain trends, and it made me think. It does excite the imagination to think, and of course, I I love that thought. And when I joined the horrendous saying when I joined the army, it was 2001, the South African Army. And this was 6 years, 7 years. So integration that you mentioned now, it happened more or less 94 to 96, to be fair to the old SADF. They had planned this before. They had already put in plans before. And so I saw this new army. We were Sundaf, the new people, and then you had all the former forces, with their what is it, Unitas, medal. So they've all been, so MK, UPLA, form non-statutory, and did I leave anyone out? MK, UPLA, non-statutory, and SADF. And so this is what I saw. But day to day, there was, and this might just be limited, right? I know maybe in the 95 there was some tension. Like I've done some interviews where I heard there was tension, and I think Thula, you may have mentioned it too, about between UPLA and MK. So there was that did play out. Maybe a bit of argy-bargy. But I would say at the point that I joined, we had 1998, which was Operation Bullias in Lesotho, which lots of people kind of knocked and criticized and whatever. And I'm just going to mention that history is being revised. There's a revisionist view of that, because yes, there were mistakes, but if it was that bad, I'm not sure. And I think there was a lot in it at the time, So a lot of people are really looking at that. But just to give you a context, so in 1998, by 2001, I had joined, and then went through the process, and I was lucky to become an officer, etc. Because a lot of it is luck, let's be honest. And then what I saw day to day in a regiment, in operations, and so on, it was just people getting on with it. It was just really, hey, we have to get water from over there. Hey, listen, did you get the ration packs for that? Hey, does this person have ammunition? And the political side for me, I think there was one case that I can remember personally, that I can remember of, one person that was MK, and someone made a comment, but something about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and you'd have to attend. And this person took it personally, but the two shook hands afterwards and they made their peace. That was the only incident that I can remember. Sorry for that long explanation. So going back, at that time, I think it was a bit more difficult in the initial. I think there are definitely a lot of similarities, but the initial phase, like you mentioned, 1910 wasn't just suddenly everything was great. It was a hard slog. And, it's in the correspondence with Botha tells Smuts, he says, you won't believe the racial feeling between British and Boers. At one point, he says, I've given orders that you just don't meet with this person anymore. And so the nitpicking between different forces, different doctrines, and different approaches, that plays out in the campaign. But when you take the emotion out and all of that, they achieved victory with the reinvasion in 6 months. So it's effective, right? Like, no matter how we call it afterwards, and when all those ideas, you just just lift yourself away from it. It wasn't that bad. The experience in German East Africa, maybe that's a different discussion. The First World War, a different force also, but I think there certainly are parallels, but because it's. And I think what it shows is a long discussion. Before 1910, what were the forces? Who were the interested parties? By 1912, the formation of the UDF. 1913, the Land Act. So now we're saying, this is great, but not black people. So that's strong racism right there. And 1914, the war, the First World War, and this really is it's really tests the fabric, and it falls apart. The first knock, when they're hardening and tempering, and it just falls apart. By 1915, you see the results in the elections, because all of a sudden, Botha, who was the savior, the romantic general, the British love him, but the Boers hate him. From the Free State, many. They might respect him begrudgingly because of the Anglo-Boer War, but they don't like him, and suddenly they've lost a lot of seats to the Nationalist Party in 1915. And I think when you take that same parallel, up the one, and I'm going far with it, but you see the ANC winning. They are the savior. Nelson, and you have all these amazing, for me at least, Nelson Mandela, you have Oliver Tambo, you have Sisulu, etc. And they're coming in, people of character, and then Thabo Mbeki takes over. But slowly things, by 2009, and those years, suddenly the economy is not where it's supposed to be. Corruption, and I'm not saying there's corruptions all the time, right? But things take a dip, and I think I just meant the change is constant, so from 94 onwards, and the same from 1910 onwards, there's a constant change happening.
Can you speak to us about how the conquest of German and South Africa ends? Can we identify a moment when the German army definitively breaks, and what is that period between the army breaking and the Germans capitulating and just wrapping up the war? So
the biggest concern was to catch the force as a fighting force and not let them move through the Caprivi Strip or go into some sort of guerrilla operations. And that was done because they keep on retreating, and at the end, Botha even gets further and further and has them cornered and sends out a big enveloping force. And sort of between Otavi, Korab in July 1915, they managed to envelop them completely. And if I'm honest, if they fought, they probably would have held out longer. But at this point, it's almost certain that Frank was ready. He just like, yeah, this is a done deal. We're ready to surrender, and that's really the definitive moment. They tried to negotiate beforehand, but that was the time they just realized the game was up. There was nowhere to go. It was a matter of time. Either complete annihilation or accept some sort of terms. And Botha and Smuts were the right people to negotiate with, because they weren't harsh.
And tell me, what happens to German Southwest Africa afterwards? Black Southwest Africans, and it becomes a League of Nations mandate. And from there on, the country's fates are tied together for the rest of the 20th century. Tell us a bit about this, please.
Yeah. So I also want to mention during the fighting, they also there were people from modern Namibia fighting on the side of, and like Morris, for example, was from the Bondelswarts, and he would later be a part of their rebellion, but he fought on the side of the South Africans, mentioned in dispatches, right? He was a guide. Then you had the Basta community who also tried to rebel at that point. They obviously had historical grievances with Sam Kubus, and Botha didn't want them to, and the South Africans didn't want them to. You can imagine the reasons was they wanted to win this outright themselves and not owe concessions or anything to anyone. But they did. So they had agency. People had agency, and they did their best with what they had. Then, to your point, the war ends and South Africa starts administrating from then on. It's the mandate, the C mandate, etc., C-class mandate. It becomes a formality, and Jan Smuts, through his savvy, manages to negotiate it. But it becomes a colony in all but name afterwards, and it becomes a place for South Africans to settle in Southwest Africa. But the terms they give the Germans is pretty fair. They say, right, okay, just go back to your farm and you can keep your rifles or whatever. There are people in Namibia at the time with an axe to grind, because there was the genocides at this point, maybe 10 years before, 1904, 1908. So there was killings, and then they put some sort of law to keep things calm. So things were a little bit tense, but everything was kind of kept where it was. And then there were some, the Wambo people nation that was more in the north, they faced a lot of hardship afterwards, and they put in some a food program to take care of the people over there. This shouldn't be seen as it was caring, but in patriarchal terms, because later on they went a long way to quash a lot of rebellions in Namibia, Southwest Africa. And as you mentioned, this was the political agenda for the 20th century up until 1990, with when Sam Njomo becomes president. So this really sets out there, and from there there's this clash of cooperation and also some amount of cooperation, collaboration, because people just want to get on, and also resistance, right? There's always, which eventually becomes SWAPO, plan, etc. Much later on, but there always is this element of people fighting for the rights afterwards, and yeah, it becomes a mandate, and there's a lot of debate, from there, because Smuts goes on to defend South Africa's claim, very dubious claim to Namibia later on, even after the Second World War. At this point, it's bizarre, right? Even through decolonization more broadly in Africa. So but it really is. It was the only thing that they could hold on to in 1915 at the elections, and they thought that was going to win them more votes. So they were absolutely wrong.
Finally, in addition to your and Professor van der Wag's Botha and Smuts in the First World War, what books did you find most useful and helpful, and which ones would you recommend to an interested reader wanting to learn more about this war, more about German Southwest Africa?
So I think there's I can't claim to be an expert, on the broader Namibia. I'm sure I can ping you guys something afterwards, because there's a much longer discussion. I focus so in such a small way, but I would say there's a bit of work that was done by Anne Simpson on German Southwest Africa. There's also articles done by Evert Kleinans, which is very focused maybe on niche elements of the campaign. And then there also are a lot of historical accounts, which I would recommend, like of Collier and others that were there, just to get a flavor of what people thought, and this kind of myth making that they were writing at the time. The great general with Botha, and so just to you can get them online. So just to to get a flavor of because that really was how the historiography started. Like everyone, of course, a tradition of soldiers who write afterwards, and in this case, selling their own story. So those are some of the books I would say would be maybe a good shot.
And then, of course, your own. Thank you for this.
I mean, I will shamelessly peddle my work.
Tony Garcia, thank you very much for your time. Thank you. It was lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lindie. Thank you, Thula.
Thank you.